Today, junior doctors delivered a two-day NHS, a 5-day strike planned for September, the longest in NHS history. Good evening. It's been a dramatic summer. The Brexit vote, a new government, and amid the historic upheaval, many had assumed that the vexed relationship between junior doctors and Jeremy Hunt was fixed. Well, think again. It's come back with a vengeance. When junior doctors went on strike last time, it was a historic first. Now they want to make history again by going on strike for 5 days, the longest in NHS history. Is the fractured relationship between Jeremy Hunt and the doctors too severe to heal?
This is devastating news for patients. Perhaps 100,000 operations will now have to be cancelled. Around 1 million hospital appointments will have to be postponed.
Also on tonight's programme, Theresa May summons her cabinet to Chequers to tell them Brexit really does mean Brexit. But what does Brexit mean? Could we be about to see a breakthrough in the effort to help sufferers of Alzheimer's disease? A new drug has shown some promising results in early clinical trials. And as Rio readies itself for the Paralympics, athletes with learning disabilities tell us of their frustration at being excluded from the Games.
And we've been speaking to the novelist Ian McEwan about his 17th novel, which is narrated by a fetus. He's been described as Britain's national author, so what does he make of the state that we and the world are in? And as the Prime Minister says Brexit does mean Brexit, can he resign himself to the UK's fate?
We now have to accommodate a narrow win, and I still feel Parliament should have its say.
Don't get sick in September. 5 days of all-out strikes starting on September the 12th. Junior doctors have ramped up their industrial action in the bitter and long-running dispute over their proposed new contract. The British Medical Association approved a rolling programme of stoppages after junior doctors rejected a compromise deal over the pay and conditions package, many arguing that it was being imposed by the government without their consent. Widespread disruption now looms across the NHS, as our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald now reports.
For one very brief moment, it seemed as if the picket lines would be no more. But a deal agreed between the government and the British Medical Association was rejected by junior doctors and medical students. And now a meeting of the BMA Council has approved more industrial action. Junior doctors will stage a full withdrawal of labour for 5 days between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. from Monday the 12th of September to Friday the 16th. Further dates, the BMA says, will follow.
We've had a very difficult conversation at the BMA. No doctors want to take industrial action, but the silence from the government, the lack of a response and the rejection of the contract by junior doctors has meant that really we were left with no other choice today than to take further industrial action.
But tonight the Health Secretary, as you would expect, expressed dismay at the decision.
People will rightly ask themselves why the BMA, who championed this deal as a good deal for doctors and a good deal for patients only in May, are now saying that it's such a bad deal that they want to inflict the worst doctors' strike in NHS history on patients, making them absolutely miserable.
It is a massive escalation, and you mustn't underestimate the shock that is being felt in the NHS. We face the prospect of cancelling perhaps the best part of 13,000 planned operations and treatments for patients.
Where are you, Jeremy? In July, 58% of junior doctors rejected the new contract, reflecting tensions between those who believed it should be agreed and then improved on over time, and those who said it was untenable.
Save our NHS! Save our NHS!
Although it saw a pay increase and some concessions on antisocial hours, Saturday and Sunday would be paid as plain time. This was regarded as a massive concession by the BMA. And those against the contract said it still discriminated against part-time workers and did not deal with the recruitment and retention of doctors. But most of the anger is directed at the link the government insists on making between 7-day NHS services and the junior doctors' contract. Despite unprecedented strikes between January and April, the public has largely supported junior doctors. But BMA council members are said to have expressed concern that they may lose that goodwill with further industrial action.
Well, Victoria joins you now from the BMA, and also here junior doctor Rachel Clark, who supports the latest call for strike action. Now, Victoria, isn't this a bit of a risk, in fact, an incredible risk for the BMA?
Yes, and I think they recognise this. First of all, the junior doctors had really pushed for this meeting today because they said time was of the essence. This contract imposed by Jeremy Hunt and the government is due to come into force in October, and they said if they were going to reject it, as their members had, they needed to show strength, as it were, in numbers. Now, the BMA Council, my understanding, sources tell me, is that on the first vote it was divided right down the middle, those for and those against taking further industrial action, cognizant in many ways of the support that they might lose from the public, and that support has been very high, actually, despite taking 1-2 days strike action over the past 6 months or so, since January. The next vote of the BMA Council, it was only 2 more members, my understanding is, who said to go ahead with this industrial action. Now, at the moment, they're only talking about September, but all indications are that it will roll on until somehow they can get back around the negotiating table. And at the moment, it's quite hard to see how that will happen.
Victoria, thanks very much. Rachel Clark, you've been listening to all that. 5 days. Are you being serious?
I couldn't be facing that with a heavier heart. No doctor could possibly pretend that that isn't a huge and serious undertaking, and nor could we pretend it's not without potential risks to patients.
Is it irresponsible?
No, and the reason for that, I believe, is that this essentially is the kind of risk assessment that doctors make day in, day out when we assess our sick patients. Of course, there are potential risks to striking, but at the same time, there is an enormous potential risk which the Secretary of State and his government are undertaking by a year ago, promising the government, promising the public a 7-day NHS, but not funding it and not staffing at it, and saying that they will deliver it solely by renegotiating the contract of a finite number of junior doctors.
But if you're one of those 13,000 people whose operations have been cancelled, frankly, that stuff is irrelevant.
I don't think it is irrelevant.
Well, it is to them.
Well, last week we heard stories about entire accident and emergency departments being closed because there aren't enough junior doctors to keep them open. We're hearing reports of whole departments in some hospitals, OBS and Gynae, and a hospital in Oxford being closed for the same reason. There's a crisis in the number of doctors in our health service at the moment. And so how, in that context, can you possibly safely stretch this workforce even more thinly? Because that's what Jeremy Hunt is pretending is going to make you safer at weekends.
So you're now going to strike for 5 days. There's a possibility of another 5-day strike in October and then another one in November.
Yes.
As we get into the winter season.
Yes.
This could go on and on and on.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Both sides are digging in.
Well, I absolutely, and I think we've got to the point now where we clearly have to end this. This is ridiculous, and to do that, it's very simple. A year ago, the government said they'd deliver a 7-day NHS in soundbite terms: no funding, no resources, no doctors. The BMA, my union, unfortunately signed up to the fact that they would deliver said 7-day NHS.
They shouldn't have done that.
Cost neutrally. They shouldn't have done that. For a year, grassroots junior doctors have fought tooth and nail not to allow that charade to be imposed upon our patients, because we know stretching us more thinly is dangerous. Every member of the public knows that you don't get something for nothing. The only people who pretend you can are con merchants and politicians, and that's the charade.
But the public would also say, a lot of us have to work nights, and a lot of us have to work 7 days a week.
Yep.
And you cannot risk people's lives, whether you want a better pay deal or not.
No doctor goes into medicine thinking they're not going to work nights, weekends, bank holidays. We all do it. We do it gladly because we want to be there 24/7 for our patients. But if you want to take risks seriously, how can you possibly make weekends safer, put more doctors on at the weekend, in the absence of any new doctors without pulling them away from Monday to Friday. That's the charade of this 7-day service.
Just so finally, do you think there will ever be a deal struck between you and Jeremy Hunt, or is that relationship just beyond repair?
In a sense, the personalities are not what matters here. He's the current health secretary, but the issue here is the policy. There will be no deal unless the government has an honest debate with us and the electorate. They have a duty of candour here. Either they are willing to resource their 7-day NHS, or they are not. And if they're not, we will never accept a
And you're prepared
contract.
to risk the support of the public?
I am confident that when it comes to the crunch, the public knows who to trust. The government have always pretended this is Saturday overtime. It's not. It's about their safety.
Rachel Clark, thanks very much. Cathy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Now, the lady's not for turning. There will be no second vote, no staying in Europe by the back door. Theresa May has told her cabinet it's now up to the government to make Brexit a success. The Prime Minister gathered ministers for a day of talks at Chequers, telling them to come up with positive ways to deliver the next step in the process. So what could that mean in practice? And is this the final nail in the coffin for the Remainers? Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Ministerial black cars lined the drive at Chequers, the setting for the Cabinet's first wide-ranging discussion about Brexit. The pro-Leave campaigners are outnumbered more than 2 to 1 around this table. Just one reason why the pro-Remain Prime Minister feels she must repeat there's no turning back.
We must continue to be very clear that Brexit means Brexit, that we're going to make a success of it. That means there's no second referendum, no attempts to sort of stay in the EU by the back door. We're actually going to deliver on this.
Boris Johnson nodded his head. He's actually been a supporter of a second referendum in the past. The Prime Minister said she hoped the government would also focus on social reform. One cabinet minister she sacked on taking office said Brexit and the economy would dominate everything, whether she liked it or not.
But obviously over the summer, quite a lot of, the last few weeks, quite a lot of work has been done. And we're going to be having an opportunity today to discuss this. We will have an update on Brexit. We'll be looking at the next steps that we need to take, but we'll also be looking at the opportunities that are now open to us.
Most of the Brexit discussion came in the afternoon when the civil servants had left the room. One after another, ministers outlined what opportunities Brexit presented for their departments. Theresa May told the Cabinet that she wanted to push ahead with formal notification of Britain's intention to leave the EU, Article 50, as it's called in the jargon. I understand that Theresa May believes, having said in public that she wanted that to happen early next year, in her mind that means January or February. Number 10 said that there was strong agreement amongst the Cabinet today that there was no need for a parliamentary vote ahead of that moment, and although Scotland and the other devolved administrations would be consulted, they would have no veto on the decision. Downing Street said there was agreement in Cabinet today that Britain needed controls on the numbers of people who come to Britain from Europe, but also a positive outcome for those who wish to trade goods and services. Quite how you marry those two remains an unknown. Likewise, whether the EU is up for that sort of deal. Cabinet ministers are now back in Whitehall, where 2 new departments sprang up over the summer, stealing desks and people off the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office, either side of Downing Street. David Davis's department for exiting the EU has been squatting in 9 Downing Street, hot desking. It'll soon burst into offices of its own, probably just over the road in the old Department for Energy. Liam Fox's new Department for International Trade has stolen personnel and space off the Foreign Office, as Dr. Fox proudly boasted 5 weeks ago in an interview with an American Republican radio host.
My gosh, in thousands of people, it's got to be, is there a new Ministry of International Trade somewhere?
We are taking over a wing of what was, or what is at the moment, the Foreign Office. So we'll be based between Downing Street and the Foreign Office, and that's going to send an important signal.
Big money hirings from outside the civil service haven't really started yet, but when they do, international trade lawyers can retail at £5,000 a day and upwards. For now, though, the government's been able to pull in pro bono free help from big-name accountancy and consulting firms, only too happy, it seems, to assist.
I think the big consultancy firms and accountancy firms and legal firms will all be trying to get their foot in the door and offer help to the civil service, because they can see that this could be a lucrative source of work for them further down the line.
And they get a lot of insights into what the government's planning, maybe in some influence.
Well, I think that the civil service will be keen to try and establish Chinese walls wherever appropriate. But yes, I think that the insight to be gained will not be of inconsiderable value to those firms.
Downing Street said the Cabinet didn't want to copy any existing arrangements non-EU countries have made with the EU. Britain should have a specially tailored agreement with the organisation it's now leaving.
Well, I'm joined now by the Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng, who believes Britain should invoke Article 50 and Brexit quickly, and the Labour MP Chuka Umunna, who campaigned for the UK to remain in the EU. Kwasi Kwarteng first. Theresa May was very clear. You must be very pleased.
I'm very happy. I think Brexit means Brexit. And people say, what does that mean? Well, I know what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean staying in the EU. It doesn't mean the status quo. It means actually listening to the vote and having the humility to try and, execute, as it were, the will of the people.
So, Chuka Umunna, it's all over, really, for the Remainers, isn't it?
Well, look, I accept the result. I mean, Brexit means Brexit is a ridiculous phrase. It's basically saying Britain leaving the European Union means Britain leaving the European Union.
It does.
But it's meaningless. And what is extraordinary about it, it's taken 50 days, this is the 50th day of Theresa May's premiership, for her to bring the Cabinet together to brainstorm on the biggest issue facing the country. And even more reprehensible is the fact that you have prominent Vote Leave campaigners like Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, Liam Fox, Priti Patel. All these people told us they knew what Brexit looked like before the referendum, and yet now they're having to brainstorm on it because they're clueless about what will happen next.
Chuka understands that there's Article 50 and it's a 2-year process. There's no point rushing into something without due preparation.
All right,
there's no point. We were in the EU for 43 years. That's longer than I've been alive. It's going to take a lot longer. I mean, people.
So you're happy for a lot more brainstorming before Article 50 is triggered?
What I'm saying is that Article 50 will be triggered very soon. But given
that's not what Theresa May said.
Well, in the next 6 months to a year, that's soon. Given the fact that we were in this thing for 43 years. I know people who've, if you're in a marriage for 4 years, it might take you 2 years to get out of it. We were in this thing for 43 years. Well, I mean, give us a break.
It's just common sense.
Well, look,
absolutely.
Well, I think it's very interesting, actually. Look, I'm with Kwasi in the sense that I think there's no rush whatsoever to invoke Article 50. It's interesting.
Except he said there is a bit of a rush. 6 months he'd like to see it.
Well, Kwasi, as a member of the government, has just said they're looking at invoking it between 6 months and a year. To some extent, there's a bit of a debate as to whether the Prime Minister needs to come to Parliament to invoke that. I'm not sure she does. But never mind...
Oh, really? So you don't want MPs to have a veto?
Well, look, in practice, MPs have to pay attention to the result.
I'm glad he said that.
Which, although it wasn't overwhelming, was a clear result. But
right, so no veto. Let's be absolutely clear.
I don't think that would be a good look for Parliament. No. The people have spoken. I think it'd be rather patronising to pretend that somehow we know better. However, look, it's not just about whether Article 50 is invoked or not. There's a huge amount of EU law which has been incorporated into UK law by dint of the European Communities Act 1972. I'm getting rather technical here, but basically it says that in certain areas, like employment rights, for example, EU law has primacy over domestic legislation. Now, that will need to be repealed, I suspect, but there's a number of things that flow from that, because if you look at some of the rights at work that people in this studio have, agency workers, for example, their right to equal treatment, that is based on laws arising from that 72 Act, which will fall away. So it isn't just about the deal that we reach with European Union partners. There is a huge domestic legislative job for Parliament to do.
That may be true, but when Chuka was mocking Brexit means Brexit, it's very clear to me that the status quo is unacceptable. And that's what Chuka has the decency to appreciate that. Not everyone on your side does. I mean, some of them are still rerunning the fight.
OK, but when you say Brexit means Brexit, does it, for example, mean that access to the single market is dependent on the free movement of people?
For me, free movement of people is a red line. I will not... I would be quite prepared to walk away from the single market. We have to be in the negotiation. I mean, look what happened to Cameron. The fact that he got very little was predicated on the idea that he was not credible. No one thought he wanted to leave the EU. That's why he couldn't get a deal.
Do you accept that you won't get access to the single market and keep freedom? You can't have your cake and eat it on freedom of movement and single market.
I think that's right, but there are a number of people in Cabinet, many prominent members who were Vote Leave campaigners, who said we could maintain the kind of access that we have to the single market now, but avoid paying into the EU budget, and we wouldn't have to take the free movement with it. Now,
which is not what you said in the campaign.
No, I said during the campaign, look, part of the reason I don't think we should leave the European Union is because we want to maintain access to the single market, and I didn't think doing in our economy was the way to deal with the immigration challenges. But as Kwasi said, look, I accept that the people have spoken on the issue of free movement. What the Prime Minister is now going to have to try and do is square the circle of maintaining free access to the single market without us paying into the budget, and also without us accepting free movement as we know. And look,
that is the opposite of what you said in the campaign.
It isn't the opposite of what we said. In terms of the Stronger In campaign, part of the reason we said that you needed to stay in the single market was because one of the reasons we said free movement was going to be difficult to avoid was because Vote Leave campaigners were saying we maintain access to the single market. I never pretended, look, we never said you could square the circle.
But what I'm saying is when Brexit means Brexit, that means a difference to the status quo. What Chuka and many people on his side are saying is that actually we're going to leave, but we're going to be the same. They're essentially reheating a dish, a meal that was rejected, and pretending that it's different. And that's not going to work. People are too
contradicting
smart
yourself
to accept that.
You're contradicting yourself in this interview. You just said that I accept that we've got to move on from the status quo.
But many people on your side, I've said.
Well, they can speak for themselves.
They can speak. Are saying that we're going to have exactly the same arrangement.
Well, clearly,
and I don't think that's acceptable.
But clearly, we're not, because we're going to be outside the European Union.
Okay,
but let's try and get the best deal for the British people that's a progressive one, that helps promote fairness, prosperity. We meet our climate change obligations. We continue to help tackle global poverty. Let us try and do those things with a close working relationship with them.
Very finally, it looks like Jeremy Corbyn is going to be re-elected with an increased mandate. Can you and he remain in the same party?
Look, the Labour Party is not going to split. I'm not going anywhere. So unless he is, I think we can, but I'm not going anywhere.
Chukwuemeka Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you very much for joining me. Matt. Oh, well, and stay tuned. We'll be back later hear back from the Labour leadership contender Owen Smith's constituency in Wales, where Brexit supporters are keen to forge full steam ahead. Matt.
Now, he wants to build a wall along its border and described its citizens as rapists and drug dealers. But Donald Trump is about to land in Mexico for talks with Mexican President Peña Nieto before giving a major speech on immigration later tonight. The meeting was hastily arranged after a surprise invitation from the Mexican leader, provoking an inevitable storm of outrage from Mr. Trump's detractors. Well, our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris joins us now from D.C. Kylie, the Donald has flown south. What's going on?
Well, it's a very high-risk move, Matt. I mean, this is travelling to the home of the neighbour who have publicly insulted in the strongest terms for the past year. As for President Peña Nieto himself, he has in the past likened Trump to Hitler. He is doing very poorly in terms of popularity at home. He might feel motivated to embarrass his guest. So, yes, it's a very bold move from the Republican candidate. Their staff say they're going to be talking about drugs, about trade, about immigration. But I think for Donald Trump, this isn't about Mexico. This is about appearing presidential, about displaying a measure of moderation to those voters in the middle whose support he is losing. It's a country that imagines him more as a piñata than a president. He's called their legal system corrupt. He's called their country corrupt. He's accused them of sending criminals over the border, rapists, murderers, to the extent that he intends to get Mexico to pay for a big, beautiful border wall. In terms of inflammatory language, there's not much Donald Trump hasn't said about the US's southern neighbour.
They're laughing at us, at our stupidity. And now they're beating us economically. They are not our friend, believe me. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
We're gonna build the wall, and who's gonna pay for that wall? Who?
But he's unlikely to leave with a big bag of cash. His arrival in Mexico City today has met with disdain from senior figures like former President Vicente Fox.
He is not welcome to Mexico by 130 million people. We don't like him. We don't want him. We reject his visit.
But a spokesman for the Trump campaign explained what makes the visit, no matter how unwelcome, worthwhile.
It's a decisive presidential move. He wants to establish a conversation with a neighboring country, a leader, and also to discuss the common problems and challenges that our countries face.
Former Secretary of State and Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton says it's not diplomacy, it's a stunt.
And it certainly takes more than trying to make up for a year of insults and insinuations by dropping in on our neighbors for a few hours and then flying home again. That is not how it works.
Nevertheless, will it work for Trump? Well, I'm not sure how he loses here, to be honest. If Peña Nieto criticises him, it makes him look generous for going there in the first place. And if there is a pleasing photo opportunity, it makes him look presidential. He gets to play the strong man, but at least gives him the patina of being able to do deals. Perhaps it's more of a risk for Peña Nieto, who's already being criticised by many Mexicans for inviting Trump in the first place.
Kylie, thank you very much indeed. Now, he was both chief propagandist and chief foreign recruiter of so-called Islamic State. Experts say that the death of Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, announced by IS yesterday, will be a major blow to the extremist group. US officials say they're still working to verify that he was killed by one of their drone strikes and dismissed Russia's claim that it was their planes that were responsible. So how significant was al-Adnani? Here's our foreign affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman.
With a $5 million American bounty on his head, it's no wonder Abu Muhammad al-Adnani often kept his identity obscured. He appeared in and probably supervised this video back in 2014, when so-called Islamic State used a bulldozer to symbolize the destruction of the colonial-era border between Syria and Iraq. It was IS's heyday and a personal triumph for Adnani, who was born Syrian, yet had earlier fought with al-Qaeda in Iraq.
After breaking this border, the border of humiliation, the answer will be a caliphate. I swear we will erase the borders from the map.
Adnani was one of the world's most wanted terrorists because of his skill at online propaganda, inspiring and ordering attacks overseas. He repeatedly called on Muslims to attack the West. 2 years ago, he talked about running over Europeans with a vehicle. The lorry attack in Nice last month left 86 people dead and followed this Adnani broadcast in May.
If the oppressors have shut the door in your faces, then open the door of jihad in theirs. Truly, the smallest act you do in their lands is more beloved to us than the biggest act done here. It is more effective for us and more harmful to them.
His CV on this jihadist website says he was twice a prisoner of American troops in Iraq and an al-Qaeda poet before becoming the spokesman of the so-called Caliphate of IS. Its headquarters are still here in Raqqa in Syria, but IS has not mounted a show of strength like this in many months. It's losing money and territory as well as people, facing airstrikes from a US-led coalition. Yet today, the Russians claimed Adnani was killed by one of their jets. American officials say that's a joke, that it was a US drone strike on his vehicle.
We conducted a precision strike yesterday targeting Adnani near Al-Bab, Syria, and we are still assessing the results of that strike. Now, with regard to the Russians, we have no information to support Russia's claim that they also carried out a strike against Adnani, and I would just note that from the start, Russia, as you know, has spent most of its time, its military campaign, supporting and propping up the Assad regime. It has not devoted much, if any, effort that we're aware of targeting ISIL's leadership.
The Americans are still to confirm Adnani's death, which IS announced yesterday. Even if IS replace him as expected, the loss of their chief propagandist and foreign recruiter is surely a significant blow.
Jonathan Rugman. Well, someone who served at the highest level of US foreign policy is Leon Panetta. He was both head of the CIA and Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration and was at the heart of the Clinton administration as Chief of Staff. He joins us now from Monterey in California. Welcome on the program, Secretary Panetta. If I could ask, first of all, what you think of the killing of Mr. Adnani. Does that make a big difference in America's, or indeed the West's, war against ISIS?
Well, if it is confirmed that he was killed in the strike, then I think it is a blow to the leadership of ISIS. And even though they'll make an effort to replace him, I think one of the things we've learned from going after the leadership of al-Qaeda was that as you decimate their leadership, it makes it much more difficult for them to be able to continue to plan attacks. And I think that that's the hope here.
Do you think that America is now winning the war against ISIS?
Well, I think we're making progress. I don't know about whether or not we're winning yet, but we clearly are making progress in the effort to go after ISIS. We've deployed special forces there. We continue to conduct airstrikes. It is apparent that ISIS is beginning to move away from some of the territories that they were able to conquer. And so we are making progress, but it is very slow progress.
Now, let's talk about Syria for a minute. The Russians are heavily invested in Syria, on the ground to some extent, in the air to a very large extent. Do you regret that the Russians seem to be filling a void left by the United States?
I think what you're seeing is just another part of the chaos that is Syria. Syria is a chaotic situation right now that involves not only the United States going after ISIS, but obviously the effort to try to get Assad to step down. The Russians are trying to protect Assad. The Turks are moving in against the Kurds. We have Hezbollah present. We have Iran present. It is a chaotic situation. And the fact is that as a result of all of these different forces that are at play, we still are not seeing any hope about eventually bringing that war to any kind of successful conclusion.
But would the situation be any less chaotic if your former boss, President Obama, had respected his own red line about chemical weapons, which he then ignored once they had been used?
Well, look, there's no question that mistakes have been made in the conduct of this war. I think it would have been better for the president once he established a red line to have enforced it. But he continues now in the effort to go after ISIS. We have put a number of steps in place. We are making some progress in that effort. And I think the key right now is to try to see if we can bring some kind of coalition together so that we are all working towards the same aims as opposed to opposite aims. We need to defeat ISIS, but we also need Assad to step down. Those are the two goals in Syria.
Okay, you have said in the past quite clearly that if President Trump were to become a reality, if Donald Trump is elected, that he would be a security threat to the United States and the world. Do you really believe that?
What I worry about with Donald Trump is that he clearly does not have the temperament or the judgment or the experience to be a commander-in-chief. The things he said about, undermining our alliances, spreading nuclear weapons, speaking highly about dictators in the world, promoting torture, all of those things represent the very opposite of what the United States stands for.
Right.
So I worry about his ability to truly be able to provide leadership in the Oval Office.
But if he does actually get into that Oval Office and you don't trust him as the commander-in-chief, what will the security establishment do? What will the Secretary of Defense do? What will the generals do, especially if he threatens to use nuclear weapons, as he has theoretically done?
Well, that's a question I often get, but our forefathers provided a constitution that provides some real checks and balances in the process. They didn't want to centralize power in any one branch of government, including the presidency. So anything that Donald Trump might try to do as president could very well be checked, if not by the Congress, by the courts, and ultimately by the American people.
Very briefly, in one line, Secretary Panetta, would a President Trump be a bigger threat to American security than ISIS? That's not a choice that I think anybody wants to make because, frankly, both represent
a threat to our security in the future. Donald Trump would, as 50 Republican national security individuals said, would be a disaster in terms of being commander-in-chief. But we also face the threat from ISIS. I think we're strong enough in America to make the right decision here, defeat Trump, and proceed in the war against ISIS. I'm confident we'll do that.
OK, Secretary Panetta, thank you very much indeed. Kathy.
Thanks, Matt. Now, decades of research, countless trials, dozens of failed attempts. But could we be about to see a breakthrough in the effort to treat Alzheimer's? A new drug has shown really promising results in reversing a hallmark of the disease and may even slow the advance of one of the symptoms, memory loss. The clinical trials are still at an early stage, but experts say the evidence so far is very encouraging. Our science editor, Tom Clark, reports.
I've resigned myself that I don't remember everything, and I think friends and relations realise that as well. I'm just going with the flow.
Brenda Whittle was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease last year. Straight away, she and her husband Stephen decided to volunteer online to take part in dementia research.
And I thought, well, why not? And Stephen, in his gentle way of saying things, got me around.
It's almost within seconds that we'd registered, and they realised that Brenda was in the early stages of Alzheimer's. I think it was somewhere between 8 and 11 studies got back in touch with us.
One reason the Whittles found themselves so popular is that her Alzheimer's was spotted quite early. Scientists now believe that successive drug trials have failed because they're trying to treat Alzheimer's too late, when the brain has been irreversibly damaged. The trial they're on lasts for another 18 months. But today, early results from a trial in the US also targeting patients with early Alzheimer's may be the best anyone has seen.
I've been doing this research for 25 years, so it's been a big commitment. I work with a terrific group of dedicated men and women who are trying to make advances in the fight against Alzheimer's. This is the best news we've had in 25 years.
Within the brain, the defining feature of Alzheimer's disease is the build-up of a protein called amyloid beta that forms clumps among healthy brain cells. As the disease progresses, more and more of the amyloid builds up as brain cells die. The new drug, aducanumab, is derived from a human antibody that binds to the amyloid. This signals the immune system to remove the clumps from the brain. There were only 165 participants in the trial, but based on their brain scans, the drug looks like it's working. Amyloid, shown here in red on the PET scans, was significantly reduced. Crucially, more being cleared as the dose of the drug went up. More importantly still, tantalising evidence that the drug improved the brain function in treated patients. Dr. Kath Mummery is running a UK arm of a bigger trial of aducanumab and similar antibody drugs to see if they work in thousands of early Alzheimer's patients.
It would be fantastic if the positive signal we've seen in this drug comes to fruition, and if it does, then in the next 3 years we could have a game changer. But we have to wait and see what that trial shows.
There are still some big question marks. 40 patients dropped out of the trial due to side effects. And if the drugs do work, can the health service diagnose dementia early enough for patients to benefit?
Positive news like today's study should really put urgency into that discussion so that patients can get access to new medicines that are effective as quickly as possible.
Brenda will have to wait to see if the trial she's on will bring benefits for her. But Stephen recalls her thinking at the time.
Brenda did actually say, you know, even if it may be too late for me, and I hope it's not, we will certainly be helping other people.
Back now to Theresa May's pledge that she wants to make Brexit a success. Wales was one of the many parts of the country which voted to leave, even in places like Pontypridd, whose MP is Labour leadership contender Owen Smith. He's called for a second referendum on any Brexit deal, but not all his constituents agree. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Andy Davis.
No EU by the back door, said the Prime Minister. And on the streets of Pontypridd today, Leave voters liked what they were hearing. Among them, Jane, a greengrocer.
Yeah, that's good. Good news. I'm glad. But I want it to happen ASAP rather than next year. We're going to still be talking about it the year after. It should happen now.
Owen Smith, the Labour leadership contender, is the local MP here. He urged Remain, but a majority in this area, 53.7%, chose Brexit. And like Jane, many of those Leave voters we spoke to want it sooner rather than later. And your message to Theresa May?
Get on with it. Get on with it, you know, do it. Just get on with it. Don't, you know, why in 2 years' time? You know, you must get on with it now. The people's vote should count for something. You know, we should count. We voted to leave. Why is this taking so long to get on? You know, just get on with it now. I think we should get on with it.
And you want Brexit now?
I want Brexit as soon as possible.
But what about Remain voters? Those who wanted to keep the European Union firmly embedded in the fabric of these valleys?
Now, this machine is an electrical discharge machine.
No surprise that Gareth Jenkins voted to Remain. His tool manufacturing business, he says, has probably benefited to the tune of £1 million in European funding over the years. His message to government: slow it down. Getting the best trade deals will take time.
I think ministers recognise that within the officialdom, we do not have the skill and the expertise and the people to negotiate trade deals. We haven't done it for 40 years. So just for that reason alone, we're not geared up to do trade deals. And that's going to take a couple of years at least before we get to that position.
So when should they trigger Article 50 and the formal talks?
About 2019 sounds good to me.
Of course, other businesses would hate the uncertainty such delay would bring.
140.
And adding to the complexity of it all, the contrasting visions of Brexit, dividing its proponents at ministerial level and beyond. What do you think Brexit means?
Out of Europe, not paying them the money, keeping the money in this country.
Out of the single European market as well?
Yeah.
Out of everything?
Yeah. Back as we were.
There must be freedom of movement. I think there must be, yes. I'd have to go with that. Yep.
And you were a Leave voter, so...
Yeah, I know.
Why are you saying it like that?
Well, I feel so. I'm contradicting myself in some ways.
But there's a lot of people voted like I did, but half of us didn't know what we were voting for. We just went and followed the rest of them.
But you're not clear on what you now want Theresa May to deliver?
No, I'm not. I'm not, mate. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I can't do anything about it.
But he certainly wasn't the only one we met today having difficulty with that one. Andy Davis, Channel 4 News, Pontypridd.
Well, many businesses wanted Britain to stay in Europe. Now they want the best possible trade deal and reassurances about the city's future. With me is our business correspondent, Helia Ibrahimi. What are the titans of the city saying about all this?
Well, they're fairly relaxed, to be honest. The big issue for them is all about the single market. And people I spoke to this afternoon have come to terms with the fact that we won't have membership of the single market. But they do believe that the government can deliver them a new trade deal that has access to the single market. So not like the Swiss deal, not like the Norwegian deal, one that doesn't include free movement of labour, but also doesn't have a bonfire of EU regulation. So ironically, after all these years, the city is desperate to be EU compliant.
In terms of the data, as far as we know, it's not been nearly as bad as people predicted.
Well, it's good news for the Prime Minister. Always good to have a better economic hand when you go into negotiations. And if you take a look at the Consumer Confidence Survey since the beginning of the year, we've highlighted the last 2 months. And July is where you see that really big fall, the worst in 26 years. But take a look at today's data. It's been resilient, and we've just switched over to house prices. Again, today's data, quite good. August up 0.6%. That's actually almost as good as any other month this year. So that initial idea that you're going to have this very stark, very big shock result from the Brexit vote has turned out to be untrue. The test will be next year when sterling pushes inflation up, which will have a knock-on effect to real incomes. Will the data be as good then?
We'll find out. Helia, thanks. Kathy?
Thanks, Matt. Now, athletes from around the world have begun arriving in Rio for next month's Paralympic Games, but Britain's team of 251 includes just 7 people with learning disabilities. That's because they're only allowed to compete in 9 events, as our sports correspondent Kamian Zerum reports.
Stephanie Moore and Reece Palmer have won medals, golds, sprinting for GB. They're 2 of the best in the world in the 100 and 200 metres. But they won't be competing at the Paralympics next week because their events aren't included. They have the wrong kind of disability, an intellectual or learning disability, and they want a chance to be recognised.
How do you feel when you run?
Love it.
my favourite sport.
So when Johnny Peacock and co take to the track in Rio, Rees will be watching with mixed emotions.
Do you feel sad that your classification isn't included?
Yeah. Needs more help, our classification.
It wouldn't mean a lot just to me, but it would mean a lot to everybody else, because there's a lot of athletes out there with intellectual disabilities who've got a lot of talent in that event, and there's some young people coming up, sim events, and they're just not given that opportunity, and it would just mean a lot to all of us if we had that opportunity and show our potential and our talent.
The charity MENCAP launch a petition tonight as we're on air, asking the International Paralympic Committee to change the ratio of events. There are 528 medal events at the Rio Paralympics, but only 18 are open to athletes with a learning disability in athletics, table tennis and swimming. This equates to less than 4% of medal chances, and only 3% of the GB Paralympic team have a learning disability. There's a reason for the imbalance, the biggest scandal in Paralympic history. Some of the gold medal winning basketball team at Sydney in the learning disabled classification were later exposed as frauds. All learning disabled events were shelved until the London Games, where they were reintroduced but in a limited number. Like the 200 metres freestyle. Remember Jessica Jane Applegate, who won gold for GB. She'll compete again in Rio, which is now in full preparation mode. But the Paralympics' long-term development strategy is to increase events for the most disabled athletes with the highest care needs, like the visually impaired. But with literally thousands of potential events across the classifications, something has to give. It is a challenging situation, the International Paralympic Committee told Channel 4 News. Not that it makes it any easier for those who miss out.
It's incredibly frustrating because with our disability, it's quite hidden. So a lot of people don't see the problem with it. I can see why they've put the events in, because you can't see our disabilities, but it's incredibly frustrating.
Not least because Stephanie and Rees have won their medals by funding themselves, and the situation at the top is mirrored at the grassroots. There are 11.9 million disabled people in the UK. 1.4 million have a learning disability. Sport England recently pledged 170 million to grassroots disability sport, 2 million to the Special Olympics and 400,000 to a Learning Disability Alliance, but that's a combined total of less than 1.5%. MENCAP say this simply isn't good enough, and it's not just about finding the next Rees or Stephanie, but about making sure from the stadium gates to the podium there really is access for all.
Kamian Zarin reporting there. Now, a woman and a child have been killed after a suspected stolen car being chased by police veered into a group of pedestrians in Penge in southeast London. Witnesses described how the car crashed into a family, trapping children underneath. Several ambulance crews and the air ambulance rushed to the scene. 3 young girls were taken to hospital with multiple injuries. Police said the driver has been arrested and is now in custody.
After the break, a tale of marital infidelity from the most unusual perspective. Ian McEwan tells us about his 17th novel and why it's narrated by an unborn child from inside the womb.
Welcome back. Now, he's been called Britain's national author, and in his latest novel, Ian McEwan has much to say on the state of the nation, but also Europe and the world too. Nutshell is his 17th book, and it's narrated by a fetus who witnesses his mother's infidelity and speaks from the womb. When I met him earlier, I asked why he picked such an unusual perspective.
Well, it's a very restricted point of view, and there's a kind of liberation in closing down your options. It launches off on this single premise that you could have a voice 38 weeks into pregnancy, free to think about the world he's going to join, free to wonder if his mother really loves him,
The fetus says feeling is queen unless she identifies as king. What is it that troubles you about this identity politics?
Well, in the first case, he says to himself, if humans are so complex, what a shame there are only two sexes. Surely there should be dozens. And then he begins to realise, in fact, there are scores of possibilities now. He then thinks this is a kind of liberation, a cause for celebration, he says, with some irony. There's so much going wrong in the world. There's concerns about income distribution, poverty, climate change, the imminent, constant threat of a nuclear exchange, all those things. Identity politics brings you too much to the self.
Of course, you got into hot water when you said, call me old-fashioned, but most people with a penis are men.
Well, you see how easy it is to get into hot water. I think that, you know, as I tried to elaborate in what was then taken as an apology, I just thought it was a clarification. It's brilliant that people feel that they can express themselves in all kinds of ways, but that is not the totality of a politics in the world. And I think the Twitter sphere especially has got very bad at knowing how to disagree. When opinions come the way of some factions or tribes within the Twitter sphere, they become violently abusive.
And it's very quick to do so, isn't it?
It's very quick, and it's quixotic and crazed. Being in the same room and having a conversation with someone with whom you profoundly disagree without killing them or wanting to kill them, I think is one crucial element of civilization.
The fetus muses about all sorts of things. He doesn't muse on the French political reaction to the wave of Islamic terrorism, the burkini ban. What would the fetus say about that? What do you say about that?
It disappoints me, to say the least, when I pass women head to foot. But I feel it's my right to be offended by that.
Your right to be offended and their right to wear head-to-toe covering?
Yeah, I'd rather they didn't, but I'm not in favour of the state telling people how they should dress. And when we saw 4 policemen gathered around a lady sitting on the beach, I think suddenly then the nonsense became sort of too much to bear, and then I think it was quite reasonable of their equivalent of the Supreme Court to reverse the decision.
The fetus is pretty preoccupied with world events, but also what he calls this less than United Kingdom. You've made clear your displeasure at Brexit. Are you coming to terms with that now at all?
Not quite. I'm still in denial. I perfectly understand if you hold a referendum, the government that poses the question will get a bloody nose. I never asked to live in a country run by plebiscites. I blame us to some extent for not asking the important questions beforehand, like what is the status of this referendum? Is it binding on Parliament?
You didn't see this coming. A lot of people didn't see it coming. Do you feel now that you're out of touch with the country that you're living in? Do you feel that a bit?
To some extent. I mean, I understand, just to come back to that other point, why people would vote to leave. If their lives were not running well, especially economically, under the current arrangement, why not try something else? It's perfectly rational to try something else. What have you got to lose? So the vastness and complexity of the questions were boiled down to a simple matter of how are you with the status quo? That might as well have been the question of the referendum. And the answer we got was a fairly narrow, not very happy, thanks, we'll try something else. We now have to accommodate a narrow win, and I still feel Parliament should have its say.
Finally, this was your 17th book. Do you ever think you'll get writer's block? Do you ever think this is going to be my last?
I don't believe in writer's block.
Evidently not, with so many books behind you.
No, but even when I feel my head's completely empty, that's the time not to write. That's the time to read, or travel, hang out with friends, see your grandchildren. Yeah, read Hamlet for the 100th time. Hesitation is a crucial element of creativity.
Ian McEwan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
No hesitation here. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
Good evening.